surprised he left his show. Do his show. Things like that. I'll tell you what it is. There's so much stuff. So what time is it? It's Thursday over the lunch hour. Nice to meet you. Nice to meet you.
Gotta get. Good evening. I'm Alex Jones. I'm director of the Joan Shorenstein Center on the Press, Politics, and Public Policy, and I want to welcome you to this discussion that we have entitled Private Lives, Public Figures. We have a terrific panel to discuss some of these issues. Some of these issues seem almost nostalgically sweet in a way after the events of September the 11th. But they're very important because what they are at their base is a factor in who will be in public office, who will decide to seek public office, and what the standards of journalism should be when dealing with public figures and public officials especially, elected officials. I was looking in preparation for this at what was in the news in the New York Times 3 years ago today, and I found a 600 or so word article about how Linda Tripp was being questioned by a grand jury about whether it was illegal for her to have recorded Monica Lewinsky's private conversations with her. I looked at the New York Times similarly from 3 months ago, and there was a similarly sized article in the New York Times, both of these in the New York Times. The only piece of news in the one from 3 months ago was that Gary Condit might be interviewed for a fourth time by the Washington police. As I think all of us recall the flurry of Condit stories this summer. This was one that I would say was in the egregious category because the only piece of news was about something that might happen. It was in the lead, and all the rest of the story was a sort of compilation of all that had gone before, which says something about the news judgment of the news organization that is said to be the principal standard bearer, journalistically speaking, for the American media. So what are the standards and what should they be? Tonight we're going to be talking about that with a panel of people who have, I think, a very high standing for discussing that very subject, beginning with Marvin Kalb to my immediate left. The way we're going to do this, I will introduce our speakers one by one. Briefly, they will speak for 5 minutes and no more, and if you see someone running around with a card holding it up, it's effectively saying, shut up, your time is gone. Because we've got a lot of people here to speak, as you can see, but everybody on this panel has something important to say, a perspective that is important. You see an empty chair at the end. Chris Matthews, who is here for another purpose. We drafted for this. He very kindly agreed to come join us, and he should be joining us midway, 15 minutes or so, we hope. Let me get on with it. Marvin Kalb, to my immediate left, as I said, is particularly well qualified to speak on this subject because he has just written a book called One Scandalous Story that deals with these issues focused on the first 10 days or so of the Monica Lewinsky story. He is also, as many of you know, the founding director of the Shorenstein Center. I succeeded him in that position last year to my great honor. He is now the executive director of the Washington office of the Shorenstein Center. Before that, he had a very distinguished career at CBS and NBC as a diplomatic correspondent and as the host of Meet the Press. Marvin Cowell.
Thank you very much. When I started doing my research for One Scandalous Story, one question that was asked of me time and time again was, how come Kennedy, who had a very adventurous life in this respect, was never touched by the press, and yet the press pummeled Clinton? And I really didn't have a quick answer on that. I mean, one of the things that occurred to me was that press standards change, and the press generally reflects the time in which it functions. So I began to think about what was it about that time in the 1960s, in the early 60s, during the Kennedy administration, that would lead a reporter having some knowledge of Kennedy's sex life to totally ignore it. And why would perhaps the same reporter or his son or daughter working in the current climate leap at the story and run with it in a big way? My own experience was that back on September 20th, 1963, President Kennedy was in New York addressing the UN General Assembly, which is what presidents do every year in September, early October. He stayed at the Carlisle, unlike most presidents who stay at the Waldorf Astoria. And the president delivered his speech, went back to the Carlisle, had a dinner, and then, unbeknownst to any of the reporters covering him, he had a late night meeting with a friend whom I happened to see the back of, because I was entering the back entrance to the Carlisle Hotel to go to Bemelman's bar for a drink. And as I entered, there were two Secret Service agents who looked utterly panicked at my presence. What was a reporter doing there? And one of them knocked me to the ground. He was so upset. And as I was on the ground looking up, I happened to see two other Secret Service agents with a woman with a blonde with stunning legs. I mean, that I give you my word for that. Quite extraordinary. And I didn't know quite what to do with the information, actually, and what I had just observed. The Secret Service agent who knocked me down a moment or so later came and apologized. And I didn't know what to do, but I made the decision immediately that this was not a news story. This was not a news story because it didn't conform to the accepted standards of journalism as practiced at that time. And also, while I was doing the research, I came upon a story that Johnny Apple of the New York Times tells. He was also in New York. It was also 1963. He was also at the Carlisle. And he also saw a young woman being escorted to see the president. Now, the way Johnny Apple describes it, he says that he saw the young woman being escorted to the president's suite. I did not see that. That is what he said. And he was very excited about this discovery. And so he ran back to the New York Times office, and he went there to see Sheldon Bin, who was the chief assignment editor of the New York Times. Bin listened to him very impatiently. And then he said, "Apple, you're supposed to cover and report on political and diplomatic policies, not girlfriends, no story." And so that was the end of his effort, and that was the end of his dream for a front-page story. I was given this by Tom Ross, who was a reporter in those days also, and he now works for some large outfit as a PR guy. But let me just read you a couple of paragraphs here. I covered John Kennedy. This is what he said up at Yale when he went to his 50th reunion, by the way. I covered John Kennedy's campaign in 1960 and his years in the White House. As a bachelor, I was a regular on what was then a small party circuit in a small southern town and was privy to indiscreet women's tales of Kennedy's escapades. By today's degraded journalistic standards, the press would have done to President Kennedy, as well as several of his predecessors and successors, what it did to President Clinton. But the standards of the time were that you did not invade the privacy of a president, and if I had raised the issue with my editor, he would have said, "Kid, when you see the President of the United States in the act, let me know and we'll decide what to do about it." Today, there are no such gatekeepers. Talking heads on cable television, and we're missing our talking head on cable television.
Well, no, we've got one.
Freelance gossips on the internet, and biased blabbermouths on talk radio have supplanted professional reporters and editors as the arbiters of the news. So the public, fed a steady diet of negative stories, salacious rumors, half-baked commentary, is led to believe that the government is a den of corrupt and incompetent men and women. I can't be quite that profound. I only have this strong sense that journalism, because it reflects the times in which it functions, had one standard for Kennedy and clearly a different standard for Clinton. One could argue, and it would be easy to do so, that Clinton invited the kind of coverage that he got. I'm not sure that he invited it, but there were any number of reporters in Washington who had it in for this particular president, and they were just waiting for something to happen. It didn't have to be a major event. It could have been, and in my judgment, this was not a major event, but it could not necessarily be described as a minor one either. But in any case, this is the kind of event that reporters jumped on. And they jumped on it for all kinds of, to me, not all that serious reasons. Later, it was said that the president violated the law, and that violation of the law led ultimately to his impeachment. I don't have an argument with that. My argument was with the kind of journalism that led to that lying before a grand jury. I probably could go on, but I'll stop and listen to Fred Schauer debunk everything I've just said.
Our next speaker, Fred Schauer, who is the academic dean of the Kennedy School. He's also the Frank Stanton Professor of the First Amendment. Fred recently won a Guggenheim Fellowship, as a matter of fact. He has been associated with the Shorenstein Center for many years, and I think in all that time has agreed with Marvin only rarely. He takes great pleasure in his disagreements. Fred Schauer.
Thank you. I realize from what Alex said that I have a role to play, so I will play it. I think I will play it with some sincerity, at least to suggest a few reasons to believe in the possibility that the standards were wrong at the time of Kennedy and right now. One dimension of living in a democracy, one conception of democratic theory is that it is for the voters and not the journalists to determine what are the qualifications for the people that hold high office. For some people, a president is a policymaker. For others, a president is a role model. For others, a president is a symbol of America. And how we think of what a president or any other public official is will determine what is or is not relevant to determining that. For some voters, marital fidelity is one of the qualifications for the presidency. For others, honesty is a qualification for the presidency. For still others, honor is a qualification for the presidency. If we are talking about the Supreme Court and going back to the nomination of Doug Ginsburg in the 1980s, for some people, deciding cases is what it is to be a Supreme Court justice. For others, being a model for fidelity to law, no matter how minor that law is the job description of a Supreme Court justice. One way of understanding this issue is who gets to decide what is the job description and therefore what is relevant. For those of us somewhat more sympathetic with more disclosure rather than less on some of these issues, it is basically the issue of whether voters should get the information that they believe is relevant to their voting decision rather than have it screened by journalists on the belief that it is journalists rather than people who should decide what's relevant to the particular office. Related to that, and second, rational voters may very well take certain forms of behavior as statistically valid, even if not necessarily true, indicators of the kind of behavior that they think of as important in their public officials. Let's continue with President Clinton. It's quite well known, and if it isn't, I'll make it a little better known. Bill Clinton cheats at golf. Not merely mulligans on the first tee, not merely winter rules. Bill Clinton plays a game that bears at best a dim resemblance to the game that even those of us who are casual golfers play.
What's your source?
Actually, I've got a bunch right here. The best is an article, I believe, from the New York Times entitled 18 Holes with President Mulligan. But we can talk about this later. Certainly, no one suggests that we are electing a golfer in chief. On the other hand, for those who believe that honesty is important in a president, for those who believe that there is something important about that dimension of American historical tradition that thinks it useful to recall that Abraham Lincoln walked 6 miles to return 3 cents, or was it walking 3 miles to return 6 cents? It may nevertheless be the case that however irrelevant in one way golf cheating or other forms of cheating may be, it might be statistically indicative of something that they in fact think relevant, and therefore might plausibly be something that they want to read about, that they want to hear about. Third, and here I make no claim to originality and just want to transmit a couple of ideas that have been around in a fair amount of feminist theory for some time. The language of privacy, the word privacy, and the concept of privacy has for a long time been used to shield from public view and shield from legal scrutiny and shield from attention a range of activities that ought not to be so shielded. Whether it be sexual harassment in the workplace, marital rape, domestic violence, or some number of others, the home, the workplace, have for a long time been thought of as domains of privacy, domains that people shouldn't look at, and therefore domains that are immunized from perfectly appropriate scrutiny. Marvin referred to the norms of the early 1960s.
The journalistic norm.
The journalistic norms of the early 1960s. When he's finished shaking hands, I'll keep going. Referred to the journalistic norms of the early 1960s. In terms of those norms, there was certainly a norm that, in large part, anything to do with sex and anything to do with alcohol was off limits. One possibility is that those norms were overprotective of professionally and politically relevant behavior. Alcohol abusers whose alcohol abuse affected their performance, Senator Williams of New Jersey in the early 1960s, for example. It may be that we've gone too far in the other direction now, but it's possible that in the 1960s we went too far in the direction of non-disclosure of undeniably relevant information. Finally, let's not forget that many of these things, and Marvin is correct to describe them as changing professional norms, vary quite dramatically from culture to culture and time to time. If you bring a lawsuit in the United States, a private, ordinary civil lawsuit in the United States, you expect that your name and all of the details in the lawsuit will be available for public inspection. If you would bring an ordinary private civil lawsuit in the Federal Republic of Germany, your name remains private, your name remains secret, and the lawsuit is referred to forever, only by number and not by the name of the litigants. I don't know who's right and who's wrong, but the dramatic difference between the US and Germany on this indicates that there is more cultural contingency than we often think. And if there's a lesson in all of this, it's that the word privacy doesn't do any argumentative or conceptual work at all. It's the label we attach at the end of the argument. If we think it shouldn't be out, we call it private. If we think it should be out, we call it public, but the word privacy doesn't help us at all. Thank you.
Thank you, Fred. Evan Thomas is Assistant Managing Editor of Newsweek. He was the Washington Bureau Chief there for 10 years, ending in 1996. And as you will recall, Newsweek was the place where this story emerged. It emerged because Matt Drudge got wind of the fact that Newsweek was working on it and basically put it on the web, and Newsweek in response put the story out. He also is the author of a biography of Robert Kennedy, who had a private life of his own. Evan Thomas, what's your take on this?
Well, I was Mike Isikoff's rewrite man, so I was part of the problem. I think Marvin's book is really useful because it takes you minute by minute through the decision-making in a number of newsrooms, and ours and New York Times and others. And I've never seen such a close-in look at the way things really are inside the sausage factory. And it's not pretty, but this is my point. It's great to talk about rules and standards and what we ought to do, but in the real world of this, it's murky and confusing, and you're always operating on incomplete information with competitive pressures. And Marvin's book really captures that. I mean, just to talk about very briefly about Newsweek, we knew about Monica Lewinsky for months before we printed a word about it. We didn't even think about doing anything until Mike Isikoff walked in the door and said that the special prosecutor, Ken Starr, was thinking about bringing an obstruction of justice case against the president. That's when we moved into action, and we had a number of very difficult decisions to make on a short time frame. This is on a Wednesday, I think. We had our closes on a Saturday. We had to decide what to do about this. We had not interviewed Lewinsky. We hadn't interviewed any of the principals. We learned from the special prosecutor that they were about to run a sting operation by putting a wire on Linda Tripp and then flipping Monica Lewinsky herself to put a wire on her. Ultimately, that was their plan, to put a wire on her, send her in the White House, and catch either the president's lawyers or the president instructing her to lie before the courts. That was the special prosecutor's hope on this crazy weekend that this story broke. We had very difficult decisions to make about what to write about that. Ultimately, we didn't write a word. We held the story because we had, we thought, not enough information. Now, it's true that Drudge helped force it out, although, frankly, I think Drudge is a bit of a red herring. The Washington Post was going to find out about this story in a number of days anyways, Drudge or no Drudge. This story was going to get out. Anytime the special prosecutor starts investigating the president for obstruction of justice, that story is going to get out, and properly so. The question is how, with what parameters, what are you going to say? Those are all difficult decisions. We made them imperfectly. Marvin's book is unflattering to Newsweek, but it's a very good book.
Thank you.
Emily Rooney. Emily is executive editor and host of Greater Boston on WGBH here in Boston, of course. She's a frequent panelist on CNN's Reliable Sources. She's won Emmy and Edward R. Murrow Awards, and she spends a good bit of her time every week chewing over the media that she is a part of. She's also was the executive producer of ABC News for a time. Emily.
A very short time. Actually, we have a saying in my family, actually from my father, and he says, we're all better off in the end knowing everything about one another because then we can make the judgments. And I know that the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, but I really believe this myself, that I'm going to agree with you, Fred, that when I go to the voting booth or when I read a newspaper about a source, Marvin, I'd like to know everything about them, including the name. I want to know who they are and what they think and what they believe, including, by the way, their sexual preference, how they voted on certain issues. I mean, I have no problem. Why can't I know what you believe about your personal life, your sexual preference? That's not going to dissuade me from voting. Well, maybe it will. Oh, wow. What if it did? At least I would know in the end. And I feel that, frankly, Marvin, I don't lament the journalism of the past. I know there's a lot of hand-wringing that goes on these days about, the days of Walter Cronkite and Edward R. Murrow and Huntley and Brinkley, and I grew up in those days, and I feel very shortchanged for what I had access to. I'm grateful for what Newsweek can do now in such a short time span. How incredible it is that they can turn around their front cover in 5 hours or less, I'm not even really sure, or that we can get news from the front lines, even if filtered through the Department of Defense. We have access to things that we never dreamed of so many, many years ago. I would never go back, never go back. I often criticize the very organization that I work for, which is PBS. I'm a very video-driven show because I believe that if that's what you do, if televisions are your words and they are your pictures, you should be able to provide them. We were saying earlier, Marvin, that Dan Rather said that the networks were driven by fear, or Dan Rather more accurately said he was driven by fear. And one of the reasons why PBS isn't is because they don't have that competition. But nobody watches PBS. And I wish they did, because they provide a fabulous outlet and a fabulous forum, but they're not driven by the same competitive factors. And whatever anyone wants to say here about what's available and what's good, everybody votes by what they pay for and what they click to. And if you don't pay for it or click to it, it isn't worth it. So if they're turning to what Chris Matthews offers or what Evan Thomas, that's what the people want, regardless of what they, by the way, fill out on the surveys, because we've all seen that.
Thanks, Emily. David Pryor, director of the Institute of Politics here at the Kennedy School, 6 years in the House, 4 years as governor of Arkansas, 18 years in the Senate. It's 28 years of total experience, most of it lived in close proximity to Bill Clinton.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, you are, I don't know, is my mic working?
Yeah, it's fine.
Good. You are looking at the token politician tonight. I think I'm the only one. I know that Chris certainly worked for a very well-known local politician for many years, Tip O'Neill. But I'm honored to be in this position and to be invited, Alex, by all of you, and to be appearing with you. 2 weeks before Governor Clinton became President Clinton, I was in Washington. I was in the Senate at that time. And I purchased on the street from a street vendor 2 weeks before his inauguration a button. The button said, "Impeach Clinton." 2 weeks before he became president, they were already trying to impeach him. It never stopped. It continued throughout his presidency. One night, as a matter of fact, I happened to see him in Little Rock, and I knew I was going to see him, so I stuck this button inside of my, it was toward the end of his presidency, and I opened my coat, and there was "Impeach Clinton," and he said, "Oh my gosh, where'd you get that?" I said, "Mr. President, I bought it 2 weeks before you became president." But anyway, that's just a little story. You know, I asked Tom Winship, who was with the Boston Globe. I think Mr. Winship is here. He was the editor for many years of the Boston Globe, and frankly, between us, I still wish he were there. But anyway, I said, "Mr. Winship, how do you think the press has covered this country and this crisis since 9/11? And he said superbly. And as a general rule, I would have to say, and I am a politician who from time to time has suffered the brunt of some, you might call that political journalism or journalism per se, whatever. But I do think that in our country we have a wonderful press. I really do. I get angry with our press. I get angry with the media. I got angry the way some of my colleagues got treated. I was on the ethics committee, by the way, for 11 years in the Senate. And that is the drudgery work of the Senate. There are only 3 Republicans and 3 Democrats. And once you get on that committee, you cannot get off. They will not let you get off. It's terrible. But I will never forget, and we brought up Harrison Pete Williams, that case. I believe Fred brought this up. I'll never forget having him before our committee. And he was telling us about Abscam, and he was telling us about how he got sort of entrapped or whatever to go out to the hotel and meet with this dressed up FBI agent who dressed up as an Arab sheikh or what have you, and offered him whatever, and Pete Williams, if he didn't take it, it looked like he was going to take it, and he didn't just flat out say no, and one thing led to another. I would have voted to expel him. He saved us that vote, and he resigned. But I'll never forget that he told us that on a Saturday night, I believe it was a Friday or Saturday night, he and his wife were having a dinner party. He went down to the local grocery store to buy a quart of milk or some ice or something for the party. And as he came back into his driveway, the media, they were all there, right there. It was there, whatever. And in fact, he walked into his house and he said, "What is going on?" And his wife, Jeanette, says, "I don't know." And he looked up in a tree. He went up to his bedroom sort of to retreat, and he looked up in a tree, and the window, the shades or drapes were open in his window bedroom. There was a TV camera up in the camera looking down into his room. I don't like that, and I don't think any of us like that, and I don't think journalists should be very proud of that, and I don't think politicians are very proud of what Senator Williams did and others in that business have done. But it was too bad that that intersection took place. But I can tell you that given all the facts and all the figures and all the history, we're a pretty lucky country to have what we have in the freedom of the press aspect of our daily lives, and I'm very proud of it. I'd like to say one thing. I'm going to get fired tomorrow. I'm going to take issue really hard with Fred Schwingel. Fred has become a victim of someone else's propaganda. Bill Clinton does not cheat at golf. He does not. I have played golf with him. And if he hits a mulligan, he asks you if he may hit a mulligan. Do you ever say no? Of course not. If he says, "I missed that putt, you mind if I putt again?" Of course not. But I don't call that cheating. Now, if he were at Augusta playing in the Masters or something, I would call that cheating, Fred. But I think that was a little bit harsh.
Thanks, Dave. Chris Matthews is the host of Hardball on MSNBC. In 1987, he became after leaving Tip O'Neill, became the Washington bureau chief of the San Francisco Examiner, which in fact is where William Randolph Hearst got his start. He really found his calling on television in the Lewinsky story, because really, night after night, Chris Matthews pounded that story. And I think that it was fair to say that that was the one that you became most celebrated and certainly most successful at on television. He has a new book out. It's a very intriguing title. Now Let Me Tell You What I Really Think. What that suggests is that you haven't been saying what you really think. Is that true?
Oh, you want me to talk for a while? There's a great, Mike McCurry was a great guy. He had a terrible job defending Clinton as his press secretary. And the best of that story, the senator, he gets a call. This is really good. This is really good. It's very nice. It's about loyalty of staff to politicians like I try to be. And he gets a call from the New York Times. It says, your boss took some money from a guy. This guy's name's Weinstein, first of all, the agent, which is kind of funny. He's dressed up as an Arab. And he says, he took a bunch of money from this guy. So Mike calls up the senator and says, you won't believe it. The New York Times is going to go with a story tomorrow morning that you took some money from a guy, a federal agent, posing as an Arab sheik or whatever. And Pete's great answer was, what you tell him? I just love that one. And so Pete was a great guy. He smoked unfiltered cigarettes. I liked him just for that. I like men of daring. And he was also nice to staff people, which separated him from a lot of liberals, actually. Conservatives, ironically, are much nicer one-to-one to a lot of people. And maybe not ironically. Anyway, so he got over, he said, well, you better come over to the house. I love that. You better come over to the house. So have a cup of coffee and tell them what trouble they were in. I think a lot of these are good academic discussions, and you have to have a standard that's at least available to you. But, you know, when you go back and look at, you know, I think of the choices when you really have story to break or not, and you have something on somebody, maybe you bumped into them socially and you learned about something, or as a reporter, somebody who wanted to get them told you something about somebody's private life, and you have to decide whether to just forget about it. I was told by my paper for a while, we want to out some people who are homosexual for gay people. And I said, well, I don't do that. You know, I just don't believe in doing that. Well, members of the community disagree with you. I said, well, I'm not a member of the community, okay? And I don't really care what the community thinks on the topic. I'm not going to out anybody. So that's a value judgment, and I accept it. I have one. I don't want to do it. If somebody wants to be in the closet, let them stay there. And I didn't even like Noel Coward. You know, they take his plays and play around with them now because they want to make a statement that he didn't want to make. It was his right, what statement he wanted to make. So I think that kind of judgment. What often happens, though, in recent history is that women talk about relationships. The old days of the Kennedys where he'd call you a couple months later and say, just called to tuck you in, dear, you know, to keep them happy, not mentioning any names. Those days are over because these guys can't pick their partners, you know. The silence is not golden anymore. And so you have press conferences. Jennifer Flowers held a press conference, okay? It wasn't like this story was dug out of the trash can, you know? I mean, she went on television. She got some flack in New York to hold a big press conference, and luckily the quality papers buried it. I think if you go back, Marvin, everybody, Times and everybody put it way in the back. In fact, it was bottom of the story, not just bottom of the fold. No. And so there was a real effort to try to keep that straight. Paula Jones, of course, brought a suit, and she ended up getting some pay dirt out of it. It was kind of murky at the end, but she brought it publicly. Monica, talk about a talker. She found the president's worst enemy and blabbed everything she had about her very important friend. So it wasn't, you know, investigative reporting. They brought these stories to light. So it wasn't like, oh, what do I do with this story? It's on television. I mean, it's already past you. Now, I do think that there are real ethical questions. The only thing I ever broke, I mean, I exploited the hell out of a few stories, but the only thing I ever broke was this poor story, which I think regret, which is it was at a press conference, it was at a fundraiser for Dick Sweat. There's a funny name to start with. Dick Sweat up in New Hampshire, a fundraiser for him, and I didn't name him. So it's like Barney Frank loves Dick Armey's name. He thinks that's a riot. While they're having this fundraiser, backstage, two regular guys, frat boys, Bob Kerrey and Bill Clinton, are trading lesbian jokes. Well, that's fine, except typical, Bill doesn't get caught. Bob does. I mean, what else is new? So Bob's telling this stupid joke, and by the way, as jokes go, it was totally harmless. I mean, it had no I didn't have hostility towards different people's lifestyle. It was just a setup joke to make Jerry Brown look like an idiot. It was sort of an elephant joke or Polish joke, if you will, one of these old kind of jokes that just has the same old setup. And so I hear about the joke from obviously somebody working for Tsongas, right? You don't hear about it from somebody in the campaign, and I go, what am I going to do? I don't want to do. So I confirmed the story and the facts, and I knew what had happened. It was on C-SPAN and had on their tapes and everything. So I confront Kerry's people with it, and they said, well, it was late at night, he was tired and all this. And I catch Clinton over at the, he was over meeting with Gephardt, and he had George Stephanopoulos with him, and I finally catch him, and he goes, yeah, it was late. He just flushed the toilet on the guy. He said, oh, it was late at night, you know, it was off the record. In other words, he said it, and, you know, we nailed him. And so I break the story. The last edition of the San Francisco Examiner that night was like the real late edition. It was at the bottom on the right-hand side. Next day, Bob Kerrey is scheduled to visit the AIDS wing at the San Francisco General Hospital. So act up. I mean, everybody's out on this guy. Everybody's chasing him around, and he ends up saying, well, I have to reconsider who I am, and all this meltdown he's doing. I mean, totally self-confessional. Oh, it was awful. I got to reconsider who. It was an existential sort of meltdown over a joke. I mean, just apologize and move on. So it turns out that Bill Clinton moved on, and Bob Kerrey was out of that race. And then I read later in George's book, Stephanopoulos' book, about how they manipulated it so when they talked to me, they got a certain spin out of it and made it look like Clinton was the better guy. And there's something, he used some magic word I forgot that made it look really stinging. So I think those kinds of decisions, I look back and I say that telling that story did nothing for the public good, for me to report that story. It told me nothing about Bob Kerrey, told you nothing about Bob Kerrey. If I'd had this story on Clinton and the way he handled it, that might have told us something about his character, the way he let a former, war hero, disabled war hero, swing instead of just saying, get off it, Chris, we were both telling the jokes. Just be a guy, or a man, or a mensch, or a woman, or whatever. Be a person. And he wasn't. Now, I can't report that's too nuanced a story, that one guy has character and the other guy doesn't. But, I think those are the kinds of marginal stories you confront. Another story we broke, which I'm sure everybody in the panel will have a different opinion on, when the House of Representatives voted to impeach, if everybody remembers that, it came down to about 30 votes at the end. The Army didn't have the vote. DeLay was like, DeLay reminds me sometimes of the guy with the plate in the closet in American Beauty. You know that guy? Chris Cooper's character, a little sensitive. This guy's tough. It's tough. And the Republican Party, by the way, more and more is made up of the bad guys on To Kill a Mockingbird, if you wanted to. Got a good picture of some of these guys. So we find out that what they're really doing is taking these 30 undecided Republicans, DeLay and those guys, they're taking them over to what's called the Jury Ford building. It's one of the annex buildings, and they're putting their face right in this Juanita Broderick story, which NBC had been sitting, everybody had been holding. Lisa Haddon believed in it, Lois Romano of the Post believed it. Very credible woman, Juanita Broderick. Long, long time ago, making a dastardly charge of rape against the President of the United States, which a lot of people said, this is too far ago, one witness ain't enough, we're not going with this story. But this woman was very credible, all kinds of testimony. So these guys are going over and looking at this, and they're all deciding, moderate Republicans, a lot of them, to vote for impeachment of the President of the United States. Now there's a great question. If the American people have a constitution they'd like to see honored properly, and their congressmen or women are voting to impeach a guy based on evidence they won't even present to the public, that is not even particularly, not relevant, but it isn't germane exactly to the charges. Is that a story to report? Shouldn't the public know why these people are all trooping over there and voting to impeach when they're not even doing it on the basis of the president's obstruction of justice, alleged obstruction of justice, or alleged perjury? I think so. I think we should know this. And I don't think I was using this story as a dodge to get some dirt on TV. I think I want to know why my president, even a president I don't particularly trust, is being impeached. And so that's an interesting story that I got involved in. The Monica stuff, by the time we got on hardball, I want to tell you something. The American people are not stupid about this television. The big numbers were not when the Monica part of the story, the first quarter. The big ratings numbers for everybody in cable and public, any kind of television, the big numbers were in the third quarter when impeachment and the presidency was at stake. The people know when to watch television. And they generally get interested when there's something personal to them, like the presidency is at stake, not this sort of the voyeuristic, so what about Monica? Those numbers actually were going down until the third quarter. So I think it's interesting to say, because I think most of these stories, the women, repeat what I said, most of these stories are self-disclosed, self-revealed, self-divulged, no reporting involved, no decision-making involved. The marginal stuff that I've been involved in, I do have a conscience about and wonder whether I should have outed Bob Kerrey for telling a joke that really didn't hurt anybody. In this case of Juanita Broderick is very troubling because we have a very credible witness in terms of testimony when you meet her and interview her, but yet it's so long ago and it's so powerful in the stakes. It's a tough call to knock a presidency out of the presidency for something he may have done 20 years before. In fact, even by your lights, probably did 20 years before, but it's very hard to deal with those. And those are, to me, the tricky questions.
Let me get a very sharp focus on this if I can before we go to the audience. Marvin, I want to ask you all the same question. You are the editor. You have exclusive information, confirmed and certain, that President George Bush has a mistress. Has a mistress.
President.
President George Bush, the current one.
Correct.
What do you do? Is that a story you go with or no?
You have to give me more information.
No, I'm not going to give you more information. Simply on the basis, in the wake of the Clinton story, in the wake of the parent standard that has been applied, in the wake of what we're talking about tonight, is the fact that the President of the United States succeeding Bill Clinton has a mistress a story?
And you have that as a fact.
That's a fact. You have it nailed, it's yours, and you have it exclusively.
I probably, if I were the editor, would not at this point run it.
Fred?
I think that about 30% of the American people wrongly believe that this would be relevant to evaluating George Bush as a president of the United States. And even though I think those 30% of the people are wrong, if the phrase "the people's right to know" means anything, and I hear it a lot from journalists, then if I am an editor and no one would ever make me an editor, then I go with it.
What about on the recklessness standard, following Clinton to have a mistress that he continues to see?
Say more, I'm not sure.
All I'm saying is the issue that you raised about character, does it say something about the recklessness of a president in his situation who would continue to see a mistress now?
I think it says something, but I think I also want to insist that whether I think it says something is not the issue,
So
but whether we get above a certain threshold of interest of voters who themselves think it relevant, not whether I think it's relevant. If I'm the editor, I publish both of them.
Both, you mean Clinton?
Yeah.
Yes, okay. Evan?
I think if we were absolutely certain and it was happening at that moment, we'd wring our hands a lot and probably print it. But it's never that clean. It's just never that. There's always some extenuating factor. There's always some uncertainty. It's always murky. I've never heard of a situation that was that clear-cut.
Emily?
If it were a point of information and a point of fact, of course. I harken back to what Marvin said a couple hours ago in the forum. The problem is that most sources are the same source. And we keep quoting the one person who has the thing that told you, that told me, and you get it all confirmed with the same inner circle of people who really don't know what the hell they're talking about. But if you knew it firsthand and you saw it happening and you just absolutely knew it was the truth, of course.
David?
I think if I were in journalism and I knew this as a fact, I think I would feel an obligation to confront the president and ask him. And if he answered yes, I think I would print it. If he said no, then I think I would print it. No, no.
He said, can I putt again?
Spoken like a true non-journalist.
I think I would feel an obligation to ask him before I would print it.
Never. I'd never print it because you haven't applied the key standard, which is sex plus. What's the plus? It has to be she's a lobbyist or he's a lobbyist. It has to be that the person works for the president and is under his sort of loco parentis or some kind of authority situation, which we're all very, very modern about this. You gotta be careful about people work for you.
But
But if it didn't have any plus involved in it, what's the if it's a movie star that comes to town every couple months and has a tryst with the president at some hotel, who cares? It's not news. I really don't think that matters.
I can hear Chris Matthews saying on Hardball, but listen, the guy's following Clinton. He was impeached for having a sexual affair. How can you
He was
not
impeached for having a sexual affair.
Well, he was impeached. He wasn't convicted.
He wasn't impeached for having a sexual affair.
All right, okay. As you would.
You're wrong. Your facts are wrong.
Yeah, but
He was
Chris,
impeached because he went before the American people and used the office of the presidency, appealed to that office, not his private life, and said, as your president, I did not have sexual relations with that woman, at that point trying to trash that woman as a stalker. He didn't just walk away from that. He had casualties,
Chris,
and that was what he did wrong,
Chris,
and he also did it under oath.
Are you arguing that those?
And I would tell you this.
Are you arguing that those?
Because we've all heard the stories about the President of the United States having affairs with movie stars, and nobody wrote it. So I know nobody printed it.
What I'm saying is this. Would you then disregard the fact that he was doing this, whatever it was, and however, Clinton, you framed the terms of his impeachment? Are you saying that that does not put a special burden on George Bush not to do it?
No.
As far as news judgment is concerned?
It's a private matter. It's a private matter. Public matter, Bill Clinton made it a public matter 3 different ways: by perjury, by doing it with a staffer on the grounds. It was a workplace issue. If anybody's aware of workplace rules in this country, it was something of a violation, okay? I mean, check with corporate America, not just check with any CEO of America cannot do what the president did. Check with the CEOs. They can't do this, what you describe as a question mark. It ain't a question mark at NBC.
With that, we will open it to questions.
Nor is it a question mark at this university.
What I would like to ask you to do, we have microphones here, here, and up there. Please identify yourself and Colin and people who ask a specific question to a specific person, if you would. And if you are asked a question, panelists, please limit it to about 2 minutes response. Yes, sir.
David Marshall from Harvard Law School. This is a question directed towards the two people who were supporting unedited flow of information to the man, woman on the street. How would you respond to the government's request about 10 days ago to edit information coming from bin Laden's organization?
Who are you addressing it to?
I think it was Fred and Alexa.
I mean, I actually don't recall myself claiming anything close to a right to unedited information. I'm actually making a somewhat more specific argument about the qualifications and behavior of candidates. I do think the press, somewhat overreacted and over-cooperated, at least if that is to be believed. But I don't think that flows from what I said earlier. I'm very, very far from a First Amendment absolutist. I do think there are issues of democratic theory about voters and not journalists deciding qualifications of our leaders, but I also believe that the press too quickly over-cooperated on that issue.
Anybody else want to respond?
I agree with that. I think there's a danger in not allowing all information to come forward. And by the way, who's to say that what he says, it has some propaganda message? And if it is, wouldn't we want to see it? And wouldn't we want every nuance of the background and where is he? And let's figure out what date this is, the time, the moment. And we're smart enough. Just put it on the air. I think the networks were too quick to cooperate with. And by the way, I think they're going to go back on their word.
I think that my understanding of what happened was a somewhat different thing, that they were putting it straight from Al Jazeera, wherever they were getting it from, directly onto the air without even looking at it.
That's what they did the first
And that's like having a story in the New York Times without having an editor look at it. I think that's nuts. What they agreed to, as I understand it, is to decide, to be gatekeepers. If they decided it should be on, put it on, but not to just sort of willy-nilly put it out without anybody looking at it at all.
But I think there was also a sophisticated White House effort underway. It focused on the idea of whether television would be used for propaganda, for sending coded messages, that sort of thing. But there was another level of message there, which went out to the networks, who quickly bought into it, and that was wrong, and I join my colleagues in that. But it goes beyond that. It goes to journalists in general. It goes to government officials. It goes to people up on the Hill. It goes to the whole issue of how are you going to handle sensitive information at a time of an unconventional war? That is a very serious question, by the way. And I think the government is grappling with that, and I think that any serious journalist in Washington has to grapple with that issue also. It is simply not an automatic, this is a dreadful thing, you can't do it. You've got to examine what is going on. It could be that there may be evidence in a week or two that bin Laden has in fact been sending coded messages. I don't think so. I think it's very far-fetched. But supposing you were to find out that it's true, that would put an added doubt into the mind of an editor, I believe, and certainly in the mind of an executive producer at a network. When no network wants to appear less than cooperative with a very popular government pursuing this war.
I think it's also important that you understand that, the wake of this has not been to stop anybody. I mean, CNN has now sent bin Laden questions, and that's been public, and they announced it to their public, and there was no real there was no huge response, not even from the White House, as far as I know. Yes, sir.
My name is Ryan Friedrichs, first-year public policy student at Kennedy. My question is about the panel's opinion about the politicians' sort of the level that they need to answer to. And the standard that Bill Bradley set up was that you could ask him a question, a criminal question. Ask him if he was a criminal, but you couldn't ask him if he was a sinner. Basically, that he was trying to establish criminality as a bar. And So what does the panel think about that? And what is George Bush's line of cocaine? I'm not going to answer that. How does that follow from that, if that would be a criminal matter versus sort of a morality question?
You're never going to find a bright line. In the real world of this, I mean, just to take the hypothetical, I mean, I hear Chris's point about it's got to be sex plus. The fact is, in newsrooms, we would have found that plus. One way or another, we would have somehow conjured up a plus in order to get it in there. And that's why you can't, these simple rules just don't work, because the facts are always sufficiently fungible and manipulable to get you where you want to go. It really is a gut thing, more often than not, hard to express. I mean, if you had a transcript of the arguments in editors' offices over these sex stories, it's a muddled mess. And Marvin captures this pretty well in his book. It's not a clean, neat, logical, carefully worked out Harvard Law School argument. It's a muddled, confused, visceral, uncertain, frightened grope.
Anybody else want to take a crack at that one?
I assume that there are quite a few people in the U.S. who could say with some truth, I am not a crook, or I am not a criminal. It's an awfully low bar. Political figures all the time run on their moral character, not just that they have not committed a crime. And it seems somewhat surprising to suggest that that there is this dramatic difference between criminality and sin, in the sense that so many political figures so often are essentially running on the I am not a sinner or I am a moral person platform.
If I could, Alex, I'd like
Sure.
to respond also to that. I think Fred is absolutely right, but I would take that one step further. I think if you run on a moral platform saying that I am moral and I'm more moral than my opponent, usually that person pays a price. And we see it time and time again. We've seen, I won't even call the names, but usually that person is scrutinized even more in more detail than the person he may be running against. And so I will tell this to any of you students who are thinking about running for anything these days, be careful about proclaiming your great morality and having a monopoly on morality, or you'll get caught.
You know, I think it'd be nice if you had a choice, like a Chinese restaurant, A or B, when you run for office. Now, column A, you can have your wife there, your husband there, whatever, and you can have your kids, and you can have the dog and a nice house, and you can advertise a certain lifestyle. And then candidate B can simply give his name and say nothing about his lifestyle. And he's not fair game. You know, don't brag, a more elaborate version of what you say. When these guys run for office, it's always the family portrait, the wife has to smile like Pat Nixon, and the whole thing is usually somewhat overdone. And then when they get caught messing around or whatever, it's a news story. Because they've created this thing. They've created this Ozzie and Harriet imagery, and then they run on it. And people say, oh, I like them. They seem so nice, you know. Jack Kennedy ran on this stuff, remember? They went to church. I mean, God, Jack never missed church. Jackie would go. And all you ever saw was this sort of beatific notion of this perfect little couple. And obviously the scene was far more complicated than that. And, but they got away with it for a while because Jack was pretty slick. But he was messing around with a mob mall, and he had the Godfather. He was sharing a girl with the Godfather, and I think and they were trying to knock off Castro with this guy's goons. I think that's a news story. Maybe I'm wrong. I think that's good stuff. That's a scoop.
Yes, ma'am, up here.
I'm Susan Eaton. I teach management here at the Kennedy School. My dad is a reporter and always said back in the Kennedy days that they never, unless it had something to do with the job, they would never cover it. And that was sort of the explanation. But now you've made a credible connection to the job, so maybe they should have covered it. But my question really does go to the gender issues, and it's for any of you who want to listen to it or answer it. Do we have a double standard? I mean, Jane Swift was pregnant with twins and was hospitalized a couple weeks before her confinement, and then there was a move, not to impeach her exactly, but to sort of force her to come to the office rather than have a meeting on a speakerphone and to, invoke the Constitution. It's unclear that if the male governor partner were having a prostate operation, a similar thing would have happened. And I'm just wondering whether you think that these, I don't know of any women, we've been talking about women and, you know, self-revelations. I don't know of any men who've sort of come forward to say they've been having affairs with women politicians, or whether the women are just smarter about this or what. But I'm curious whether you think we have a double standard, and whether the fact that someone is the mother of young children should be considered as part of their duty, ability to do the job, compared to being, say, the father of young children, and presumably having at least some of the same obligations. And how's the press doing on that?
Can I take a crack at that? What are you talking about? The woman lives in Williamstown. Do you know that in the last month she has driven 6 hours a day? That's what she's doing. She's driving back and forth. We're not just asking whether she's qualified. We're questioning her basic sanity. What in the hell is she doing? She's in a car 6 hours a day. She's got twins. She's got a 3-year-old. She lives in Williamstown. It should be illegal. She should be living in Newton. It should be a requirement, for God's sakes.
Are there any other opinions?
With prostate cancer. What are you talking about? And if the governor did have prostate cancer, we would be talking about this. I never understood that analogy. Yeah, and if Jack Kennedy had, what are you talking about? She was pregnant, by the way, out to here. It wasn't something that was being hidden in a closet like his affair. We all knew about it, and we were thinking, how's this going to work? And by the way, it doesn't work. All right? Boo, whatever.
Why don't you have a governor?
Let's right up there.
Yeah, where's the governor's mansion when you need it?
I know.
I'm just curious if everyone on the panel agrees with you.
I'm sure they don't.
Well, could we hear another opinion?
Yes, sir.
All right, well, I have another question for you, Ms. Rooney. My name's Matt Bianco. I'm an MPP1 student. And that you mentioned that you believe we as a public have a right to know just about everything about our public officials. And what caught my particular attention was that you have a right to know their sexual preference, orientation, et cetera, that should be disclosed. And I think maybe some other panelists on the panel might disagree with you. I think Mr. Matthews did
Completely
earlier.
disagree.
But sort of, what's your justification? Why do you, in fact, think that should, in fact, be disclosed?
Who wants to take it?
So it was directed at Ms. Rooney.
We actually have a policy at Newsweek you don't disclose. I mean, it's one of those, there aren't many red lines, but that's one of them. And I can't remember cases where are coming up, but I know it's been we don't out people. I can't remember the arguments about it, but I know it's one of those few rules that just is there.
There was in the history of American technical privacy law, privacy doctrine, quite famous case from the 1970s. A gentleman named Oliver Sipple saved the life of President Ford by knocking away the gun at the moment that Ford was about to be shot.
From, right?
Squeaky Frome.
Yes, and shortly thereafter, I believe the first newspaper to publish the story was the Des Moines Register, but I could be wrong about that, outing Oliver Sipple, making the argument that they were doing it for noble purposes because people had a stereotype of gay men as non-courageous, that outing Oliver Sipple under these circumstances was a social good because it deflated the stereotype. Sipple did not agree, sued the Des Moines Register and some number of other newspapers. In the final analysis, he lost. Technical privacy doctrine says that even if you're not a public figure, it's not an invasion of privacy if it's newsworthy. The court said that this was newsworthy, even though Sipple was a private figure. And I think it's difficult, it's problematic. I guess for me, one of the things I find a little hypocritical is the frequency with which journalists talk about the public's right to know, but then want to filter based on their own views. I think if I were a journalist, I might filter in this case. I wouldn't feel good about it. I might filter, but I certainly would never use the phrase "the people's right to know" after that.
But Fred, it is the essence of an editor's responsibility to filter information. Because an awful lot of information that comes before an editor isn't worth publishing. It's junk. It isn't checked out. It's not verified. Sure. It's not confirmed in any way. It is the job of a good editor to filter information, because you can't put it all out there.
But if
and when you talk about a public's right to know, in a democracy, this is your big point, in a democracy, the public, of course, has a right to know. Who better than the public has a right to know about major issues that will affect the lives, the fortunes, the futures of their children and themselves? I mean, it seems to me so obvious. I don't quite understand how you could argue the opposite.
No, the issue is only the issue of whether the determination of what the public has a right to know will be based on the public whose right to know we are talking about's preferences, or whether it will be based on the substantive value judgments that may very well be right of the journalist. The tension that troubles me is the phrase "the right to know," which seems to make reference to the public's preferences, when in fact the filtering is being done on the basis of the editor's or reporter's preferences. I don't mind filtering based on editors' or reporters' preferences, but then be upfront in saying it's the editors and the reporters' substantive value judgments that may very well be right, and not this in my mind, somewhat disingenuous language of "we're just catering to the public's right to know." That's the tension that troubles me.
How in God's name is the public supposed to get all of the information and decide what it is that it is then going to read in a newspaper? That is not its job. People here are professors. You're a professor. You said before that you don't want to be an editor, and you wouldn't be an editor. You're a professor. That is your job. You teach. Students learn. People are lawyers. People are dentists. But then there are journalists, and it's their job to look at the information and in the most professional manner pass it on to the public. And I find the argument, when you talk sort of a disingenuous argument, it doesn't really address the central issue, because it's Fred and I have gone through this now. 14 years. There's nothing new.
This has the air of an old conversation.
I know. Well, anyway, I think we both understand there are 2 points of view here.
Yes, sir.
My name is Martin Greenfield, and I'll show my age by going back much further than this. For about a decade and a half, the American public was essentially kept from the knowledge that Franklin Roosevelt was a cripple. I have 2 questions relating to that. First, was the press wrong in following that policy? And secondly, if that information had been disclosed, do you think the American public could properly have evaluated it in terms of his competency to be the president?
I would like to invite all the members of this panel to very quickly respond to that, if I may. Was the press wrong? Could the public have dealt with it?
Of course the public could have dealt with the information, and I think a lot of people in the public did know that fact. It was, again, at the time, the rules of the game that this was simply not to be put out. Now, you can argue, Emily, for example, earlier sort of raised what I take to be, with all my love and affection, I'm saying this, take to be a false argument when you say that you couldn't go back again and you wouldn't want anybody to go back again. You can't go back again. What was, and what is, and we're going to deal with what is right now. The only thing we can affect, possibly, is what may be in the future. If we can make journalism better than what it is today, I think we would all agree that that is a noble end. It isn't, we can't rewrite history. What happened in the 30s, in response to that gentleman's question, is that was the way the journalists saw it then. Maybe if there were more women there, maybe if there were cripples, people in wheelchairs who were journalists who would have said, put that kind of information out, possibly. But the rules keep changing with the times in which we live. We can't go back, but we can make an effort. And I think that's what many of us are involved in here. Make an effort to make journalism better. It is so central to our lives. It is so powerful. It deserves to be examined. I have a sense from all of the reporters I know, they want to do it better. It's just terribly difficult today. It often speaks about decisions made in an editor's room as being rather messy and complicated. I imagine that's true.
But this is a
And I'm
story
sorry, I
that,
didn't
this
mean
is a
to go
story that would never have been kept secret now. But there is a lot of medical stuff that may well be kept secret. Dick Cheney's heart, for instance, comes to mind.
But
What's
they're
right?
putting that out, aren't they?
Well, I
They're
mean,
putting out a lot of
we didn't know a lot about it before the election. We know a lot more about it now. David Pryor, how much candor does a politician owe the public?
Well, if President Roosevelt or if Dick Cheney were afflicted, had been afflicted or would be now afflicted with Alzheimer's disease, I certainly think that is news and worthwhile publicizing or let the public know. I think also in relation to the original question, could the public have dealt with this at the time? I think definitely yes. I think the public could have dealt with Franklin D. Roosevelt's situation with the wheelchair and being, having been a victim of infantile paralysis.
Fred?
It's not just journalism we're talking about. It's the portrayal of history or public figures, because the Roosevelt issue came up 3 years ago, the issue of whether his cigarette should be edited out of the statue of him that exists in the memorial. That editing his cigarette out of the memorial strikes me as just the same kind of thing of cleaning up history, cleaning up the truth, when I think people could have dealt with him being in a wheelchair then, and I think people can deal now with the fact that the man smoked.
Yeah.
Chris Matthews?
But first of all, I don't think they should have the wheelchair at the thing anyway, because he didn't want one there, and he didn't want a memorial. And why didn't they just have the Japanese Zeros attacking Hawaii as part of the ceremony? I mean, it seems to me that whole memorial to Roosevelt misses the wonder of Roosevelt, and that is that he was a conqueror of all these things. He wasn't a victim to any of these things. He wasn't a victim to the wheelchair. He could stand up on his braces if he had to, put on the show, and give the great speeches. And Jack Kennedy had Addison's disease, and when John Connally accused him of that at the LA convention, he was telling the truth, and the Kennedy people were lying. And there's a disease that would have been a real problem for a president. It meant you couldn't have serious surgery. I mean, I don't know all about the adrenal glands and all the breakdown, but the fact of the matter is that was a serious disease Kennedy had, and he covered it up effectively by lying. So there's one you have to deal with. Tom Eagleton had electroshock therapy, and the public absolutely could not deal with that. We know that. And I love the guy, and everybody in the press was rooting for Eagleton because we liked him. But this guy was not going to become vice president of the United States if he had electroshock therapy. And he's certainly not going to help of course, the McGovern campaign went to hell after that anyway. Either way, he was going to lose. But because if he kept him on, he would have lost for that reason. If he dumped him, he was a bad guy. So McGovern was such a gentleman about it, he let himself look like the bad guy when it was Eagleton who didn't tell the truth. It's Eagleton that put him in that terrible situation, made McGovern look bad. But I really think that what I think is so interesting about this character thing, I just want to go back because it's so fascinating, because I am re-examining my conscience. What is character? Rudy Giuliani. Opera bouffe for a marital situation. I mean, chaos. The wives fighting in the law over who gets to stay, who doesn't stay at Gracie Mansion. I mean, the total. It was Marx Brothers, right up until September 11th. And here's this man who came out of that marital, domestic hell and insanity and became the greatest figure of the time. And that was character. He knew what his job was, to be there. And he knew he had to be not just the older brother, the daddy figure, but the conscience and the soul of New York. And he knew that was his job, and he played it better than anybody. That's where the liberals, I think, are wrong about some things. Person matters, not just policy. Who the person is. But it's not sexual behavior that defines who that person is. Character is important, but sex ain't character. And I think that's what we got to learn. It's so hard to figure this stuff. Who would have known that this guy was going to be the moral, incredible Hulk? He's going to come out of nowhere. And I think that Churchill drank every day of his life. And by the way, the boozing thing, by the way, I still haven't read a year of anybody being outed for being a drunk in this town, in the town I work in. It doesn't happen. In Britain, they always say, British journalists know this, they always say he was tired and irritable. He was shit-faced, but you know, you can't say that, you know? So that's the way we don't know how to do it. We don't have the eloquence that the Brits do about exposing people's weaknesses. But I think character is important. The people who defended Clinton are wrong, saying character isn't important. No, character is important, but sex isn't character. I think we had to learn a lot, and we're growing up we're growing up on that.
Alex, is character newsworthy? Is a person who has character, is that news?
Yeah.
No, it's not news.
It's been news as far as Rudy Giuliani.
That is true, but an event caused that to occur. An event, a magnificent, awful, terrible, don't use the word
It exposed it.
but a terrible event.
Well, I mean, I think that character was also the moment when Bill Clinton was confronted with Monica Lewinsky. What did he do? I mean, the fact was he tried to hide it. He got caught. What did he do? And I think that would be, you know, I think that was a defining moment.
Well, I know a lot of people who served in Congress. Bill Natcher of Kentucky. No one's ever heard of Bill Natcher. Bill Natcher he's dead now. He's a wonderful man.
I know him. He had perfect attendance.
He had perfect attendance. He got there at 5:30 every morning. He read every letter he got. He never took a campaign contribution. Every month he took 10% of his salary. He financed his own campaigns. Anybody ever hear of Bill Natcher? No. Chris Matthews and Pryor did, but we're the only ones. But he was a wonderful man of great sterling character, but that's not news today.
Well, in a presidential election, it sure is. And character is usually the predominant issue in a presidential election.
Let's take a couple more. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Ben Bolger. I'm a real estate student here. Last year, I was a student at Columbia, and I was privileged to take Al Gore's course that he taught in the School of Journalism. And one day, as a guest, he brought David Letterman to speak on the effect of humor in journalism. And for my generation, Generation X or MTV generation, or whatever you want to talk about, both Gore and, in particular, Letterman were very realistic about a lot of folks my age fast forward over the content news, whether it's evening news or whatever, and go straight to humor. Because, in general, a lot of young people are cynical about journalism connecting up or being relevant. And I'm just wondering, what type of reaction do you have? What type of suggestions? What type of professional standards should exist for journalists to reach out towards young people and make them more interested, or at least feel more relevant to being reported? And I'd like to address it to Chris Matthews. I'm a big fan of your book, Hardball, and of course your show.
Well, you know, when we were writing speeches for Jimmy Carter, I mean, it may not be very state-of-the-art, but we would get the monologues from Carson and look at them, because in a way, they were the great measure of how Carter was doing. And when Carson turned on you, as in the days when Cronkite turned on you, you were a dead man. And so the humor setups are very important. I was talking about things changed on the question of leadership. Just a few months ago, I asked David Brenner, a Philly guy, I know him, and I said, the comedian works at the Golden Nugget, not one of the top drawer places in Vegas, although none of them are now. And he said to me, all I have to do is have a setup that George Bush is stupid and the whole audience laughs. No matter what the joke is, if the setup is Bush is an idiot, they laugh. And I was talking to Darrell Hammond the other night, and you can't tell any joke against Bush. So the setup is everything in humor. Dan Quayle's an idiot, no matter what you say. It's a joke. It's a joke just to say it. You remind everybody that Dan Quayle's an idiot, and they all laugh, then you tell them the joke. You don't even have to be funny. So the setup is the humor, is the political contribution to the humor. And I think a lot of young people today study till 11 o'clock at night or 11:30 at night. They don't catch the news. They watch Leno or Letterman or Conan, or they get the Daily Show, which my kids love. And that's where they get their news, or they get it from SNL on Saturday night. God help Clarence Thomas, God help Dan Quayle, God help George W. Bush, because they get roasted on that Saturday Night Live. But you know, that's another way to get the news. We get it from so many different places, but the setup, what the public conventional wisdom is the key to the humor. And if you can, that's why humor is so revelatory as to what people think.
Well, we're running over, but I want to get one more. We'll go around here, and there, okay? Yeah.
I'd like to ask a question to Dean Schauer, because it seems like you've been helpfully kind of drawing the discussion back to the voters on this whole question of journalistic norms. But on the other hand, it does seem like that idea of there being different hats to define what's appropriate in different realms of, the broader story at large is really helpful. And so I wonder if apart from this idea of tying things back to what the voters care about, you would be willing, in the vein of what Senator Pryor's raised and what Mr. Matthews has raised, what Marvin Kalb has raised tonight, to talk a little bit about what you do see then as being appropriate norms for journalism apart from voters.
And I'm not a journalist, so why would anybody think that what I thought about this mattered? Nevertheless, I have the floor. I do think if we put aside the voters, it's a somewhat unusual question to think about what the norms of journalists should be, because presumably the main reason to have journalists in democracy is broadly and perhaps a little bit metaphorically to think in terms of voters. Nevertheless, you say put aside the voters.
Not put them aside, but just think about norms that exist outside of just what they want.
Right. And I think then we come back to the question of recognizing up front, which I'm comfortable with doing, that when journalists are exercising this filtering function that Marvin properly says is part of editing and part of journalism, that the grounds for the filtering be transparent, the substantive backgrounds, biases, and views of the journalists be transparent, and that we begin to debunk the pretense of objectivity and recognize that journalists, like all the rest of us, have baggage, and that's perfectly appropriate to have baggage. It's perfectly appropriate to recognize that seeing is not just a matter of objectively seeing, but what we see and what we report, we filter through our own values, our own experiences, our own views, our own politics, and the like. That's perfectly appropriate, but we ought to be transparent about it rather than persisting in this language of total objectivity.
Yes, sir.
Jin Pak, first-year student at the Kennedy School. If you accept the premise that the media performs a public service, which is keeping the people informed, it'd be safe to presume then that journalists are in fact some sort of public servants, and that they have a civic duty to keep people informed on important news and not just what they think sells. I'd like to hear from the panel then how do you explain what happened with the Condet scandal? Why did that receive so much euphoric press coverage all the way up to September 11th?
Evan Thomas, take that.
Because it's sold.
But isn't there a responsibility to cover other things like foreign affairs, international security matters, that the public, I think there would be a market for that?
Sure, but my point is the marketplace is really driving this. We have created a situation where we have a messy, open competition of information and ideas, and the net result is to keep the public pretty well educated and informed. But in its particulars, it's not pretty to watch. But it's a raw marketplace solution, pretty transparent, pretty unfettered, raw marketplace solution, which is basically looking for consumers. And out of that process, we eventually get close to the truth.
Final question, sir.
My name is Bram Elias. I'm a first-year MPP here. A lot of stuff sounds, well, I think it's pretty transparently cynical that we've heard tonight, especially ending with the notion that newsworthiness on some levels boils down to because it sells. On the other hand, we get Professor Schauer saying that we should have, if we're going to talk about just educating the people, we should have a right to know anything, or almost everything. You're not a First Amendment absolutist, as you said, but Ms. Rooney, I guess you almost are. I think it's pretty clear that either the polls of because it sells, that's not all of it. And the idea of we should tell everybody everything, that's not all of it either. And I guess both of these last questions have touched on this. I just want to get back to it again. I understand this notion that it's a murky decision as to what's newsworthy and what's not. I think the theoretical question you gave to everybody about if you had a story that President Bush was having an affair and you know it's true, do you run with it? I want to know how newsworthy does another story have to be? If you've got scarce space on your front page and you have to decide what to put on the front page,
what story does it take to bump that story off? Because none of these questions are made to vacuum, I think. So if you get that story, even you, Ms. Rooney, who would run with everything, what story does it take to bump the president off the front page if there's something else going
Actually,
on?
it's interesting that you bring that up today, because I was thinking that maybe you all knew this, but I didn't, that there were 20 million tons of anthrax spores buried in Uzbekistan, which in our newspaper, by the way, the New York Times, was on the national page, and I hate that New England edition. I don't know about all of you, but I never know what the real edition says. So that may have been on the real edition's front page, so I really don't know. But I was thinking the same thing, that that there were some, not minor, but there are feature-esque stories that sort of pull you in, to pull you through the paper. I don't quarrel with an editor's decision to do that, because I look at the front page of a newspaper as a smorgasbord. Unfortunately, unlike a television station, when you really have no choice as to what your first story is, you eat what you're served. So it's a tough decision. I've never been the editor of a front page. I've only been the editor of a television station and a network newscast, and I know how you have to order your priorities. And, you know, as we used to say, the news is the news. You know, you can't recreate what the news of the day is. Well, how come the same stories are on the, because that's the news of the day. But what it would take to bump off, I don't know. For instance, I'm not sure why that one was, and you raise a good question.
On that note, panelists, thank you very much.
Okay. All right. Well,
good conversation.
As they say.